September 1231. In a narrow valley north of Kabul, Afghanistan, Jalal al-Din Mangburni faces a suicidal decision. A few thousand men under his command. In front of him, 30,000 Mongol warriors led by Genghis Khan's adopted son. The same forces that erased an entire empire from the map. No one defeats the Mongols in open battle. No one. But over 2 days of fighting in this valley, something impossible happens. 15 to 25,000 Mongol soldiers killed. More than half the army wiped out. The first and only Muslim victory against the deadliest empire of the medieval world in open combat. How does an army of fugitives massacre the war machine that destroyed cities from one end of the world to the other? The answer is in the ground beneath their feet, in the hills surrounding this position. In something so obvious, the Mongols never imagined anyone would be crazy enough to use it against them. But before we get to that valley, you need to understand what Jalal al-Din was up against. Because only when you grasp the scale of the impossible does what's about to happen make sense. In 1221, the Mongols aren't just an army. They're a psychological war machine so refined that whole cities surrender before a single Mongol crosses their gates. And that reputation isn't an accident. It's deliberate engineering through calculated brutality. Imagine you rule a fortified city. Solid walls, stockpiled supplies, thousands of defenders. You're prepared to withstand any siege, and then the rumors arrive. A city 100 kilometers to the north has just fallen. The people who tried to resist. The Mongols stacked their skulls in geometrically perfect pyramids. Children, women, elders, no one spared. And now, wall watchers report dust on the horizon. The Mongols are coming. The Mongol strategy was deceptively simple, terrifyingly effective. When a city resisted, the Mongols didn't just conquer it, they erased it from the map. Cities burned. But then, they did something even worse. They left survivors. Unwitting messengers spared only to run to the next city and spread the horror, creating panic before the army even arrived. This wasn't random cruelty. It was sophisticated military psychology. When the Mongol army arrived at the next city, the inhabitants had already heard everything. They knew exactly what resistance cost. So most of the time, they opened their gates without a fight. The Mongols conquered through fear as much as force. And it worked. Between 1219 and 1221, the Mongols swept the Khwarezmian Empire like an unstoppable storm. This empire, which stretched from Iran to Central Asia, which controlled vital trade routes, which held magnificent cities like Samarkand and Bukhara, simply collapsed. It wasn't a prolonged war, it was systemic collapse. Bukhara fell in 1220. The Mongols diverted the river feeding the city, cut off its water supply, then moved in and took everything. Samarkand, one of the most fortified cities in the Islamic world, lasted only 5 days. The Mongols massacred tens of thousands as an example. Nishapur was wiped off the map entirely. Pyramids of skulls, men separated from women from children, a display of terror so complete that other cities surrendered the moment they heard the Mongols were coming. Leading this devastation was Genghis Khan, the most successful conqueror in human history. But Khan didn't do it alone. He had trusted commanders, generals who shared his ruthless vision. One of them was Shigi Kutuk. Shigi Kutuk wasn't just any Mongol general. He was Genghis Khan's adopted son, supreme judge of the Mongol Empire, a man who had the Khan's ear. When Genghis Khan needed someone to command critical operations, he chose Shigi Kutuk. And in September 1221, Shigi Kutuk was in command of a Mongol army between 30 and 50,000 soldiers, advancing through Afghanistan to hunt down the last remnant of the Khwarezmian Empire. That remnant was Jalal al-Din. Imagine being Jalal al-Din at that moment. You are the last ruler of an empire that has been completely destroyed. Your father, the Shah of the Khwarezmian Empire, fled and died as a refugee on an island in the Caspian Sea. Your cities have been burned. Your people massacred or enslaved. You have no empire. You have no capital. You have only an army of fugitives and survivors, men who joined you because they had nowhere else to go, because resistance was the only option left. And pursuing you is the deadliest war machine the world has ever known. An army that had never lost an open battle to Muslim forces. An army commanded by Genghis Khan's adopted son. An army whose mere approach made entire cities surrender. Logic said Jalal al-Din should flee, avoid the fight, disappear into the mountains, and hope the Mongols eventually moved on. Any rational person facing impossible odds would do exactly that. But Jalal al-Din did not flee. He stayed, and he chose to fight. The question is why? Why choose an open battle when you're outnumbered, when your enemy has never lost, when history is utterly against you? Because Jalal al-Din saw something no one else saw. He looked at the Mongols not as an unstoppable force, but as a system, and every system has cracks. Every system has weaknesses you can exploit if you understand how it works. The Mongols were unbeatable on open ground. Their cavalry tactics were the most advanced in the world. They could encircle larger armies, fake retreats to draw enemies into traps, use mounted archers to tear through enemy formations from distance. But it all depended on one thing: mobility, space to move, open terrain where Mongol cavalry could exploit their speed. And the insight was simple. While every other commander tried to out-Mongol the Mongols' better cavalry, faster archers, Jalal al-Din saw something different. You don't beat them at their game, you change the game. What if you took that advantage away? What if you forced the Mongols to fight on ground where mobility didn't matter? Where superior cavalry couldn't execute their traditional tactics? Jalal al-Din looked at the Parwan Valley north of Kabul and saw not just mountains and rocky ground. He saw a chessboard where he controlled the squares. The Parwan Valley is a natural trap. Not a flat open field where cavalry can move freely. A narrow corridor boxed in by steep hills and jagged terrain. Rocky soil that slows cavalry charges. Mountainous sides with elevated positions perfect for defense and ambushes. Everything the Mongols hate. Like forcing a sports car built for speed onto a rocky mountain trail. Its advantages vanish. What makes it superior on open roads means nothing here. Jalal al-Din picked this ground on purpose. He knew that beating the Mongols wasn't about numbers or weapons. It was about stripping away the conditions that made them invincible. Think chess. Control the center of the board, and you limit your opponent's moves. You set the pace. The Parwan Valley was his board. The Mongols, drunk on superiority, were about to step into it without realizing every move was already decided. Jalal al-Din positioned his forces with surgical precision. Archers on the surrounding hills, heavy infantry at choke points where Mongol cavalry couldn't get around them, light cavalry held back, ready to hit exposed flanks. Every unit placed for the terrain. This wasn't an army getting ready to fight. This was an army turning the ground itself into a weapon. September 3rd, 1221. The Mongols, used to dictating battles and choosing the ground, marched straight into the valley. Their confidence was absolute. They'd just destroyed an empire. This was just another band of refugees. Shigi Kutuk probably thought the battle would be over by nightfall. But something went wrong. Their tactics failed. First day, the Mongols tried their standard playbook. Light cavalry probing for weak points, trying to pull enemy units out of position. The classic Mongol opening: probe, test, find the break. But nothing worked. But Jalal al-Din's forces held tight. They stayed in the valley's narrow sections where Mongol cavalry couldn't outflank them. Archers on the hills unleashed a storm of arrows on any Mongol unit that tried to advance. The rocky ground made fast, coordinated cavalry charges impossible. Watching it was like seeing an elite boxer with his hands tied. The skill was still there, the experience. But the tools to use that skill? Gone. The Mongols regrouped. They tried to go around, climb the hills to silence the archers tearing them apart. But Jalal al-Din had planned for that. Heavy infantry on the slopes. They held. Every approach became brutal. Close quarters combat where Mongol speed meant nothing. Where brute strength and defensive position mattered more than cavalry skill. The first day ended with no Mongol victory. That alone was extraordinary. The Mongols finished battles in hours. They crushed enemies' will through overwhelming force. But the sun set over Parwan and Jalal al-Din's forces were still there, still holding, still fighting. Think about the Mongol mindset. For the first time in years fighting Muslim forces, they weren't winning. For the first time, their tactics weren't working. Something else was happening too. The legend of Mongol invincibility was cracking. Jalal al-Din's soldiers, men who'd watched cities burn, seen populations massacred, fled from Mongol terror, looked at these supposed invincible warriors, and saw the truth. They bled. They retreated. They could be hurt. They could die. The invincibility was a story, not reality. That realization spread like fire through the ranks. Soldiers who'd expected to die began to believe they could win. And that shift in mindset? As powerful as any weapon. Second day, the Mongols changed strategy. Direct assaults weren't working. Probes were getting repelled. Time for brute force. Shigi Kutuk ordered massive, concentrated attacks on specific sections of Jalal al-Din's lines. Simple logic. Pile overwhelming force on one point until it breaks. Punch through, roll the rest. It had worked before. With numerical advantage and elite troops, concentrated force breaks any defense eventually. But this time it didn't. But Jalal al-Din had planned for this too. He had reserves. Cavalry held back, ready to move fast to any point under attack. When Mongols concentrated force on one sector, Jalal al-Din shifted reinforcements there. They tried another area. He moved again. The narrow terrain became his strength, forcing Mongols to attack from compressed fronts where their numbers meant nothing. Then, on the second day, something critical shifted. Not one dramatic moment, a slow realization spreading through the Mongol army like poison. They were losing. Not contained, not delayed. Losing. Mongol bodies piled up. 15,000 dead, 20,000. Numbers vary, but they all agree on one fact. More than half the Mongol army died in 2 days in the Parwan Valley. Half. Understand what that meant. Mongols didn't lose half armies. They destroyed enemies while suffering minimal casualties through superior tactics. But here, boxed into this valley, fighting on Jalal al-Din's terms on ground that eliminated all their advantages, they were being massacred. And here's the most striking part. On the second day, as the Mongols kept trying to break Jalal al-Din's lines, something changed in the fight's dynamics. The army that had been defensive, that had used the terrain to neutralize Mongol advantages, began to counterattack. Jalal al-Din saw the Mongols were broken, tactics failing, discipline eroding. He launched his cavalry reserves, not a desperate frontal charge, coordinated strikes on the exposed flanks of Mongol formations compressed by terrain. Like a wounded predator switching from defense to attack. Jalal al-Din's units, which had absorbed 2 days of Mongol assaults, suddenly pressed forward. The Mongol army, used to controlling the pace, found itself reacting, retreating. When had Mongols ever retreated in open combat against Muslim forces? Never. This was unprecedented. Then came the collapse. Mongol discipline, pushed past its breaking point, started cracking. Units fighting 2 days with nothing to show for it. Watching thousands of comrades die, experiencing for the first time what tactical defeat felt like, began to shatter. Not an orderly retreat. Panic. Mongol soldiers, warriors who terrorized continents fled the valley. Jalal al-Din didn't hesitate. He ordered pursuit. What followed was brutal. Panicked troops can't defend, can't regroup. Jalal al-Din's forces, energized by the impossible victory, chased the Mongols from the valley, slaughtering thousands more in the rout. When silence fell over Parwan, everything changed. Not just the battlefield, the entire region. The news spread like wildfire. Mongols could be defeated. The invincible war machine had bled, broken, fled. If they could be beaten once, they could be beaten again. Jalal al-Din achieved the impossible. Faced a Mongol army in open combat, outnumbered, and won. Not luck. Not fate. Pure tactical genius. He stripped the Mongols of the terrain they needed, turned their strengths into liabilities, made the ground itself a weapon as deadly as any sword. But here's the hard truth about brilliant victories. They mean nothing if you can't hold what you've won. Jalal al-Din was about to learn that winning a battle and winning a war are completely different. Parwan's victory had immediate, stunning consequences. News of the Mongol defeat raced across the region, and everywhere it reached, extraordinary things happened. Cities that had submitted to Mongol rule began to rebel. Merv, one of Central Asia's largest cities, expelled its Mongol garrison and declared independence. Herat did the same. Across the region, populations that had lived under Mongol occupation, that thought Mongol rule was permanent, suddenly saw resistance was possible. That's what impossible victories do. They break beliefs. Mongol invincibility wasn't just military fact, it was psychological. The belief that resistance was futile, that Mongols always won, that surrender was the only choice. Parwan shattered that. Suddenly, resistance seemed possible, not suicidal. That shift in perception rippled through all the lands Mongols occupied. This was Jalal al-Din's moment, his chance to turn a tactical victory into regional uprising. Unite those rebelling cities under his command, form a real coalition against the Mongols, turn one battlefield victory into a sustained resistance movement. But that didn't happen. Because while cities were rebelling, while Mongol power's mystique was cracking, something else was happening inside Jalal al-Din's army, something that exposed a hard truth about human nature and power's limits. The problem was simple: the spoils of war. Imagine, you've just survived the impossible, fought Mongols for 2 days and lived. Your friends are dead. You're exhausted, wounded, traumatized, and scattered across the battlefield are elite Mongol horses, ornate armor, weapons forged by Asia's best craftsmen, enough treasure to change your life. Your commander tells you to wait, that there's a bigger strategy, build a coalition, think long-term, you don't care, you want your reward. Now. Jalal al-Din tried to maintain control. He argued this was the moment to capitalize, move fast to unite the rebelling cities, build a force that could really challenge Mongol power. But his soldiers didn't care about long-term strategy. They wanted immediate reward. When Jalal al-Din tried to enforce order, when he delayed distributing spoils until the strategic situation stabilized, his army fell apart, not trickle by trickle, in waves. Soldiers who'd fought bravely for 2 days, who'd risked everything against the world's deadliest force, just grabbed what they could and left. Within weeks, the army that achieved the impossible at Parwan dissolved. Jalal al-Din had a fraction of his forces left. He couldn't capitalize on the victory, couldn't march to support rebelling cities, couldn't form the coalition that could have turned this into a real turning point against Mongols. Meanwhile, Mongols recovered from the Parwan shock. They responded with methodical brutality. Genghis Khan personally took command against Jalal al-Din, sent reinforcements, reorganized his forces. Then he crushed the rebellions Parwan had inspired. Merv was retaken. Mongols massacred the entire population as punishment. No survivors. The message was clear. Victories against Mongols are temporary. Mongol vengeance is permanent. Herat was besieged and retaken. Other rebelling cities surrendered fast when they saw what happened to those who fought back. Without an army, without a power base, Jalal al-Din fled. He retreated through Afghanistan with Mongols hunting him. Pushed south until cornered on the Indus riverbank with nowhere to go, he mounted his horse and rode off a cliff into the water. Some historical accounts say Genghis Khan was so impressed by Jalal al-Din's bravery that he ordered his archers to hold fire. That Khan said he wished he had a son like Jalal al-Din. Maybe that's true. Maybe it's romanticizing. Either way, Jalal al-Din survived the fall, crossed the river, and escaped into India. He'd won the greatest battle of his life, achieved what no one else could. And still he fled a refugee with no empire, no army, only the memory of a victory he couldn't keep. What does the Battle of Parwan really teach? What does this story of tactical genius and strategic failure reveal about power, context, and the limits of individual brilliance? Here's the truth no one wants to hear. This isn't just about tactics or terrain or battlefield genius. It's about the difference between tactical and strategic victory. It's about how a single brilliant moment, no matter how impossible, how flawlessly executed, can't overcome a larger strategic context. Jalal al-Din did everything right at Parwan. Picked terrain that stripped the Mongols of advantages, positioned forces flawlessly, exploited systemic weaknesses in an enemy that seemed unbeatable, achieved the impossible. It wasn't enough. He lacked the support structure to turn that tactical brilliance into sustainable strategic power. No empire providing continuous resources. No stable coalition to hold conquered territory. Just an army of opportunists who stayed while victory looked possible and vanished when they wanted payouts. Compare that to the Mongols. Parwan was a devastating defeat. More than half the army gone. Reputation for invincibility tarnished. Rebellions erupted everywhere. They recovered. Why? Because they had something Jalal al-Din never did. Structure. The Mongol Empire, like a giant tree with deep roots. Break a branch, even half the crown. As long as roots hold, the tree survives. New branches grow. Expansion continues. Parwan broke a branch. The roots felt nothing. Jalal al-Din proved Mongols could be defeated. But proving something's possible isn't the same as making it last. That's Parwan's harshest lesson. Tactical genius wins impossible battles. Without strategic context, institutional structure, the ability to turn victory into lasting power, even the most brilliant wins become historical footnotes. The rebellions Parwan inspired were crushed. Mongols retook all lost territory. They kept expanding, eventually building history's largest contiguous empire. Parwan was a stone in the road, a significant one that proved the machine could bleed, but a stone that was stepped over and forgotten as Mongol conquest rolled on. Jalal al-Din? He wandered in exile for years, eventually returned from India, tried to rebuild power in Persia, fought Mongols and local enemies, and died in 1231, probably killed by Kurdish peasants who didn't even know who he was. One of his era's greatest military commanders, the man who achieved the impossible at Parwan, died anonymous and powerless. That's the tragedy of brilliant victories without consolidation. They burn bright, shift perceptions briefly, inspire stories. Without structure to make them last, they fade, leaving only the memory of what could have been. Yes, Jalal al-Din outdid the Mongols, accomplished what no one else could against his era's most fearsome army, proved invincibility is psychological, not absolute. That tactical genius can beat overwhelming odds in the right context. But he also proved isolated victories. No matter how impossible, don't win wars. Consolidation matters as much as conquest. Strategic structure matters as much as tactical brilliance. The Battle of Parwan stands as one of medieval history's most impressive tactical triumphs. A case study in how terrain neutralizes technical advantages. Proof that no military system, however dominant, is truly invincible when its fundamental weaknesses are exploited. But it also stands as a warning. Winning the battle is just step one. Brilliance without structure is temporary. Context always beats individual tactics in the long run. You've just discovered how a leader without an empire beat the Mongols using only terrain and strategy. How tactical genius beats impossible odds when you understand a system's vulnerabilities. Why that brilliant victory wasn't enough to change history. If stories like this resonate with you, if you want to understand history's forgotten turning points and the strategic lessons they hold, subscribe. There are hundreds of narratives like Parwan waiting to be told. Moments where everything changed, where the impossible happened, where genius blazed briefly before being swallowed by history's larger currents. Each carries lessons that transcend single battles. Parwan was where a man proved Mongols could bleed. But it's also where we learned that making them bleed isn't winning. That's a lesson transcending any single battle or era. A truth about power, context, and the limits of individual genius against larger systemic forces. A truth Jalal al-Din learned the hardest way.